My name is Joel, and I now live in a small flat in Manchester, where the noise of trams and the constant smell of rain remind me that life goes on. But 5 years ago, when I was 32, I decided to move to a village far from the city, seeking peace after a divorce that left me shattered. I thought that in a place like Eldridge, a tiny village tucked away in the hills of the Cotswolds in England, I would find tranquility, fresh air, friendly neighbors, and a slow pace to heal my wounds. But I found no peace. What I encountered was a hell disguised as a rural idyll, a dark secret that stole what was most precious to me and left me with a guilt that still haunts me, like a shadow in the morning mists. Sit down, because this isn't just a story. It's a chilling memory that makes me look at every stranger with suspicion and fear that the past still lurks in the corners of my life. It all began when I decided to leave Manchester behind. The city was a constant chaos, the bustle of the streets, the smell of car exhaust, and the stress of a job at an accounting firm where numbers piled up like impossible mountains to climb. My divorce from Sarah had been a whirlwind of arguments and lawyers, and after 3 years of marriage that ended in nothing, I needed a radical change. I searched online for quiet villages in the UK, and Eldridge appeared like a hidden gem, a hamlet of barely 500 souls, with stone houses covered in ivy, a local pub called the Fox and Hound, where the smell of craft ale and a burning fireplace invited leisurely conversations, and green hills that stretched out like a living tapestry under a sky that seemed bigger than in the city. I sold my flat in Manchester, quit my job with a severance package that would give me a few months' cushion, and moved with just the essentials in my old Ford Focus, driving along winding roads where the scent of damp earth and grazing sheep made me feel I was leaving the weight of my old life behind. I arrived in Eldridge one spring afternoon when the sun filtered through the clouds and the village looked like it was plucked from a postcard. The old church with its grey stone tower, the grocery shop where the owner, a woman of about 60 named Mrs. Hargrove, welcomed me with a wrinkled smile and a packet of homemade biscuits that smelled of butter and vanilla. My new home was a 2-bedroom cottage on the edge of the village, with a back garden where wildflowers grew freely, and the silence was broken only by the birdsong at dawn. I thought, this is what I needed. Absolute peace. The first few months were a balm. I landed a remote job as a freelance financial consultant, working from a creaking wooden desk, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air as I answered emails. I met the villagers, the baker, Mr. Wilkins, who always had a story about the English weather and its effects on bread, the librarian, Miss Ellis, a 40-year-old woman with round glasses who recommended mystery novels I read during quiet evenings, and then there was Anna, the nurse at the local hospital, a 28-year-old woman with short blonde hair and blue eyes that sparkled when she talked about her passion for helping people. I met her at the Fox and Hound one night when the pub was filled with locals drinking pints of dark ale, the smell of wood smoke mingling with fried chips. She was sitting at the bar, laughing with a friend, and when our eyes met, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years. "You're the new guy, right? The one who moved into the cottage on Old Mill Lane," she said, her voice warm as the fireplace's glow. We talked for hours about life in the village, how she'd grown up there and loved the peace, despite exhausting shifts at the hospital, an old red brick building at the end of the main street where the smell of disinfectant and worn linoleum was ever present. Anna was everything I didn't know I needed, kind, funny, with a sense of humor that made me laugh until my stomach hurt. Our relationship grew quickly, like a plant watered by the constant Cotswolds rain. We married a year later in a simple ceremony at the village church, with the smell of fresh flowers and polished wood filling the air, and Anna became pregnant soon after. We were thrilled, imagining a family in this quiet village where our child could grow up playing in the green fields and exploring the nearby forest trails. The local hospital, St. Mary's, was small but seemed reliable, a 2-story building with white walls and staff who knew everyone by name. Anna had all her checkups there with Dr. Hargrove, Mrs. Hargrove's brother, a 50-year-old man with thick glasses and a paternal smile, who assured us everything would be fine. "It's a healthy pregnancy, Joel. Your wife and baby are perfect," he'd say, his calm voice echoing in the consultation room that smelled of antiseptic and medical paper. The day of the birth arrived on a winter morning when the fog blanketed the village like a white veil, and the air was so cold it burned the lungs. Anna's water broke at 5 in the morning, and we rushed to the hospital in my Ford, the smell of anxiety and excitement filling the car as she breathed deeply, her hand gripping mine. St. Mary's was nearly empty at that hour, the fluorescent lights flickering in the deserted corridors, and they took us straight to the delivery room where Dr. Hargrove and 2 nurses were waiting. The labor was long, 8 hours of pain and effort, with Anna screaming and me holding her hand, the smell of sweat and disinfectant permeating the air. Finally, at 2 in the afternoon, our son was born, a healthy baby, crying loudly, his skin pink and wrinkled. They placed him on Anna's chest, and we both cried, the moment perfect in that hospital that seemed a safe haven. "He's beautiful," Anna whispered, exhausted but radiant, as Dr. Hargrove smiled and said, "Congratulations, parents. We'll clean him up and do the routine checks." A nurse, a 40-year-old woman in a blue uniform with a professional smile, took the baby and carried him to an adjacent room, the sound of his cries fading down the hallway. We waited, Anna resting in bed, me pacing the room, a sense of suspense growing like a dark cloud I didn't notice at first. 15 minutes passed, then 30, and when I asked the nurse who returned with clean towels, she said, "Just a few more checks. Don't worry." But something in her tone, the way she avoided my gaze, put me on edge. Dr. Hargrove came back, his smile now strained, and said, "There's a problem. The baby has a heart complication. We need to transfer him to a city hospital for specialized tests." My world stopped, the air in the room turning heavy as lead. Anna began to cry, asking for details, but Hargrove was vague. "It's best not to worry you until we know more. The ambulance is on its way." They didn't let us see the baby again. The nurse said he was in an incubator, and before we could react, we heard sirens outside, the sound cutting through the hospital's silence like a knife. We ran to the hallway, but the ambulance was already leaving, its red lights flashing in the fog like accusing eyes. "Where are they taking him?" I asked, my voice breaking, but Hargrove said, "To the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. You can go there." Anna and I jumped into my Ford, driving like mad through the highway, the smell of panic in the car as Anna's tears soaked her shirt. We arrived at the Royal Children's Hospital an hour later, the large white building filled with anxious families and the smell of disinfectant that made me nauseous. We asked about our baby at reception, but the nurse frowned. "We have no record of a transfer from St. Mary's. Are you sure of the name?" My heart sank, a chill spreading through my chest like ice. We called Hargrove, but his phone was off. We returned to Eldridge that night, the drive silent and tense, the forest on either side of the road seeming darker, more menacing. When we reached the local hospital, it was closed, the lights off, the parking lot empty like a graveyard. We banged on the doors, shouting, but no one answered. We called the local police, and a sleepy officer arrived in a patrol car with blue lights flashing in the fog. "Calm down, probably an administrative error," he said, but his expression shifted when we mentioned the baby's name. He promised to investigate, but his eyes avoided ours, as if he knew something he didn't want to say. The next day, the police called us. There was no record of a transfer, no ambulance sent from St. Mary's that night. Hargrove had vanished, his office empty, his house abandoned with dirty dishes in the sink smelling of rot. The nurse was gone too, and the hospital was closed for indefinite maintenance. Anna collapsed in tears, her body trembling against mine as our world crumbled. We started investigating on our own, talking to neighbors who whispered about the hospital. It's always been strange, people coming and going at odd hours, baby cries at night that don't sound normal. An old man at the pub, with whiskey breath and sunken eyes, told me, "That place isn't a hospital, it's a business. They sell babies to whoever pays well, take them from poor or single mothers, declare them dead or complicated." I didn't believe him at first, but the pieces fit. The village's isolation, the limited staff, the sudden complications. We found reports on local forums of mothers who lost babies at St. Mary's, cases filed as neonatal deaths without autopsies. The suspense grew. Each day, an agonizing wait for news that never came. The smell of burnt coffee in our kitchen, a reminder of sleepless nights. We discovered that Hargrove wasn't his real name. He was part of a baby trafficking network operating in rural UK villages, selling newborns to wealthy couples abroad, forging documents, and silencing those who asked too many questions. Anna and I moved back to Manchester, seeking answers with private investigators who charged fortunes for vague leads, but we never found our son. We couldn't recover our baby or file a formal complaint that went anywhere, as evidence vanished like smoke, and the local police seemed complicit, the reports filed away in dusty drawers. Today, 5 years later, I live with the emptiness, a constant pain that makes me look at every child on the street, wondering if it's him. The village of Eldridge still stands, quiet on the surface, but I know that beneath that facade, the horror continues, a secret whispered in the shadows of the hills. I now live in a small apartment in Seattle, Washington, where the rain taps against the windows like restless fingers, and the air smells of wet pine and freshly brewed coffee. I'm 33 years old, working as a receptionist at a dental clinic, scheduling appointments and smiling at patients while trying to keep the memories of what I went through at bay. But 7 years ago, when I was 26, I moved to a town in Montana, seeking tranquility, thinking a small place would give me the peace I needed after years of stress and an inherited house falling apart. I found no peace. What I encountered was a town that rejected me from the first day, a place where glances were daggers and whispers hid dark secrets. Sit down, because this isn't just a story. It's a haunting memory that makes me look at every stranger with suspicion and fear that the shadows of Millbrook still stalk me. It all started when I decided to move from Portland, Oregon, where I'd grown up in my maternal grandparents' house. It was a cozy home with a backyard full of rose bushes my grandmother tended like they were her children, but maintaining it was a burden. Taxes were rising, the roof needed repairs, and the heating failed during Portland's cold winters, leaving a damp smell that seeped into everything. I worked as a receptionist at a dental clinic, a decent but exhausting job, with a salary that barely covered my student loans. When my grandparents passed away, I inherited the house, but at 22, I wasn't prepared for the cost of upkeep. That's when I saw the ad. A dental clinic in Millbrook, Montana, was looking for an experienced receptionist, offering a surprisingly good salary, and best of all, a furnished house as part of the package. It's hard to get people to move here, Dr. Harrison told me over the phone, his voice warm but tinged with weariness. We're isolated, 3 hours from the nearest city. That's why we offer incentives. It seemed perfect. I'd sell my grandparents' house, pay off my debts, and start fresh in a town where life would be simpler, with clean air and neighbors I imagined would be like a big family. How wrong I was. I arrived in Millbrook on a Monday in September of 2018, driving my Honda Civic loaded with boxes of clothes, books, and keepsakes I couldn't leave behind. The journey from Portland was long, nearly 6 hours, the last 2 on narrow roads winding through mountains covered in pines, the scent of resin and fresh earth drifting through the open window. Millbrook was nestled in a narrow valley, surrounded by mountains that seemed like silent guardians. The town was a postcard, a main street with early 20th century brick buildings, Victorian houses with well-kept gardens, and a landscape that promised peace. The dental clinic was on the main street, in a red brick building it shared with the town's only lawyer's office. My house, the one that came with the job, was 3 blocks away on Maple Street. It was a craftsman-style cottage from the 1920s, with a covered porch and a garden full of wildflowers that smelled of honey in the crisp air. From the outside, it was everything I dreamed of, quaint, cozy, a place where I could picture myself sipping coffee on the porch while reading a book. Dr. Harrison was waiting when I arrived, along with Dorothy Chen, the clinic's nurse, an older woman with a gaze that seemed to pierce through me. "Welcome to Millbrook," Harrison said, a tall, thin man of about 50, with gray hair and glasses that gave him the air of a kind professor. "We hope you'll feel at home." Dorothy was more reserved, her greeting polite but cold, as if she were measuring my every move. "Have you lived in small towns before?" she asked, as Harrison showed me the house, which smelled of polished wood and lavender from a diffuser in the living room. "Not really," I admitted. "I grew up in Portland. This will be a big change." They exchanged a glance I couldn't decipher, a moment of silence that made me feel like I'd said something wrong. The house was perfect. Solid wood furniture, a stone fireplace, a renovated kitchen with granite countertops gleaming under the light. It had 2 bedrooms, one converted into an office with a desk that creaked under my laptop. "Rent and utilities are included," Harrison explained. "We just ask that you maintain the garden and don't make structural changes without permission." I nodded, excited, not suspecting that this perfection hid something far darker. I started work on Tuesday, and the clinic was small but efficient. 2 dental chairs, a reception desk made of wood, and a back office where we handled billing. My tasks were simple: schedule appointments, process insurance, greet patients, and assist Dorothy with minor clinical tasks, like preparing instruments or cleaning after procedures. The place smelled of disinfectant and floor wax, a scent that reminded me of my job in Portland, but here everything was slower, more personal. The patients were a mix of families who'd been in Millbrook for generations, and a few newcomers, mostly retirees seeking a quiet life. "So, you're the new one," Martha Williams, a woman of about 60 with impeccable teeth, said as I updated her file. "Where are you from?" "Portland," I replied, smiling. "Oh, a city girl," she said, her tone either curious or critical. I couldn't tell. "Well, Millbrook's very different. Things are done differently here. I tried to ignore the twinge of unease I felt. Those first weeks, I noticed odd things, but I chalked them up to the difference between city and small town life. At Miller's Market, the only grocery store, conversation stopped when I walked in, the air heavy with the smell of fresh bread and ground coffee. People stared, not with open hostility, but with a curiosity bordering on distrust. "You're the new one working with Harrison," Bob Miller, the owner, asked the second time I went. I extended my hand, but he shook it quickly, as if avoiding contact. "Hope you like it here," he said, but his tone suggested he wasn't sure about that. At the post office, the clerk served me with a coldness that contrasted with the warmth she showed others. At the cafe, waitresses seemed to forget about me, serving everyone but me, even though I sat with an open menu. Small town quirks, I told myself, trying not to get paranoid. By the third week, things turned more unsettling. I'd started exploring Millbrook after work, walking the quiet streets where the smell of freshly cut grass and burning fireplaces filled the air. One afternoon on Cedar Avenue, a woman in her garden stared at me, her expression hard, almost hostile. I tried to smile, wave, but she turned and went inside, slamming the door. I chalked it up to a bad day, but it kept happening. On the main street, glances lingered too long, whispers hushed when I passed. At the bookstore, the pharmacy, even the pub, conversations paused, as if my presence changed the air. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. Once, at the post office, the clerk handed me my mail without looking at me, and when I asked if there was a problem, she said, "None." But her tone was sharp, like she wanted me gone fast. A month after arriving, things went from strange to openly hostile. One Friday morning, I found trash in my garden, empty cans, fast food wrappers, an old newspaper. It wasn't much, but it seemed deliberately placed, not blown by the wind. I cleaned it up without much thought, but the next week it happened again, this time with a broken shoe, dirty rags, and a shattered vase that smelled of damp and rot. I asked my neighbors, Janet and Paul Morrison, if they'd seen anything. "No, nothing," Janet said, avoiding my eyes while Paul suggested installing security cameras, just in case. There was something in his tone, a nervousness that made me feel they knew more than they let on. Then one morning, I stepped outside and saw my car. Someone had scratched LEAVE into the driver's side with a key or something sharp, the metal screeching under my touch as I ran my hand over the letters. The smell of fresh paint and scratched metal filled the air, and my heart raced. I took photos to work and showed them to Dr. Harrison. "This is unacceptable," he said, his face darkening as he dialed the sheriff. But Dorothy interjected, "Maybe we should wait, see if it's a one-off." Her voice was cold, almost calculated. "Dorothy, this is a threat," Harrison retorted, and called the sheriff. Deputy Martinez, a young man with a professional air, arrived that afternoon, took photos, and asked if I'd had conflicts with anyone. "No, I barely know people," I said, but I mentioned the stares, the silences, the coldness. He took notes, promised to investigate, but his expression was skeptical, like he thought I was overreacting. After the car incident, I thought things might calm down, that the culprit would be scared off, knowing the police were involved. But the opposite happened. The hostility became more overt, more coordinated, as if the entire town had decided I didn't belong. At Miller's Market, Bob started running out of things I needed. "We're out of milk," he'd say, though I saw cartons on the shelves. "That bread's reserved," he'd reply when I pointed to loaves behind him. At the Mountain View Cafe, waitresses forgot my order, serving everyone but me, and when I asked, they acted like it was a mistake, but their eyes said otherwise. At the laundromat, my clothes started getting lost or came back stained. Machine issues, the owner Sharon said, offering no apology or compensation. Each incident alone could be a mistake, but together they formed a clear pattern. They wanted me gone. 6 weeks after arriving, I realized I wasn't imagining things. I'd gone for a run one Thursday afternoon, something I did to relieve stress, following trails around the town where the smell of pine and damp earth soothed me. On my way back, I passed the community center, a small building used for council meetings and social events. The lights were on, unusual for a Thursday, and out of curiosity, I approached the windows. What I saw chilled my blood. About 30 people seated in folding chairs, listening to someone speaking at the front. I recognized faces, clinic patients, shop employees, neighbors from my street. The speaker held photos, and when they raised them, I saw they were of me, walking through town, entering my house, in my car. Someone had been following me, photographing me. My heart pounded so hard I feared they'd hear it. I tried to get closer to listen, but Paul Morrison stepped out of the building and saw me. "Kiara, what are you doing here?" he said, his voice mixing surprise and something like guilt. "I was running, saw the lights," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just a neighborhood meeting, community safety," he said, but his nervous eyes gave him away. "Good night, Paul," I said, walking away, feeling his gaze on my back. I walked home, my mind racing. It wasn't paranoia. The entire town was conspiring against me, taking photos, planning something. But what? And why? That night, I didn't sleep, staring at the ceiling as the lavender diffuser's scent became stifling. What had I done to deserve this? I'd been kind, paid my bills, caused no trouble. The next day, I decided to investigate. I called Deputy Martinez and reported the photos. I didn't see who took them, but they had them at a meeting last night, talking about me, I said. There was a pause. "Kiara, are you sure you're not misinterpreting things? Small towns can be cliquey, and newcomers sometimes feel..." "Someone scratched LEAVE on my car," I cut in. "That's not cliquey. And the photos aren't normal." He sighed. "I'll ask around," he said, but his tone was of someone who didn't want to get involved. I decided to dig on my own. I searched online for Millbrook, Montana, with terms like controversy or issues. I found articles about disputes, overdevelopment in the area, tensions between residents who wanted to keep the town unchanged and developers pushing for houses and businesses. There were also environmental concerns about mining rights in the mountains, with opposition to certain projects. Nothing explained why they hated me. Then I researched my house's history in county records. The clinic had bought it 2 years ago. Before that, it belonged to the Hartmans for 60 years. "What happened to them?" I asked the clerk. "People move," he said vaguely, but his nervousness made me suspect there was more. That night, I visited Rose Peterson, the only person in Millbrook who hadn't treated me with hostility. She lived in a cottage at the end of my street, with a garden full of flowers that smelled of jasmine. I was curious about the Hartmans, the previous owners of my house, I said. Her expression shifted, becoming wary. "Why do you ask?" "Just want to know more about where I live," I replied. She studied me for a moment before inviting me in. Her living room was cozy, filled with family photos and antiques, with the smell of chamomile tea she brewed as we talked. "The Hartmans lived there nearly 60 years, she said. "Tom and Martha, pillars of the community, raised 4 kids. Tom died 5 years ago, natural causes. But after that, Martha changed." "How?" I asked. She started talking about things people didn't like: council decisions made without community input, shady financial dealings. She'd uncovered irregularities, contracts awarded without bidding, money spent on non-existent projects. Corruption? I asked. Possibly. Martha thought so. She went to council meetings, asked tough questions, demanded records, and then the town turned on her. Friends stopped visiting, shunned her at church. Businesses refused her service. At 82, widowed, Martha sold the house to the clinic and moved to California with her daughter. I live in her house, I said, the weight of her words sinking in. To a lot of people, that house represents someone who challenged their authority. And you, by being there, remind them of that. But I have nothing to do with her, I protested. Doesn't matter, Rose said sadly. They think you might pick up where she left off, ask the same questions. It all clicked. The stairs, the vandalism, the hostility. It wasn't just that I was an outsider. It was the house, what it symbolized. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to attend the next town council meeting, held in the same community center where I saw the photos. It was the second Tuesday of the month, and when I walked in, the air grew heavy, conversation stopped, and stares pierced me like knives. Mayor Jim Kowalski, a 60-year-old man with white hair and a flushed face, looked at me like I'd brought a plague. "Can we help you?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. "I'm here for the public meeting," I said, taking a seat. "Any particular reason?" he pressed. "I want to learn how my community is governed," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Murmurs filled the room, the atmosphere thick with hostility. The meeting moved through routine business, snow removal contracts, permits. But when it came to new business, I stood. "I want to ask about some expenses in the town's financial records," I said, holding my documents. The silence was deafening. "What kind of expenses?" Kowalski asked, his tone now a warning. "Specifically, the $340,000 allocated for water treatment plant upgrades that never happened, and contracts awarded without bidding to companies tied to council members' families." The room froze. "You're out of line," said Dave Morrison, Paul's brother and council president. "As a resident and taxpayer, I have a right to question how public money is spent," I replied. Dorothy, sitting at the back, chimed in. "Maybe you should focus on your job instead of stirring up trouble." The room murmured in agreement. "I'm doing my job," I said, "but I'm also fulfilling my civic duty." Kowalski slammed his gavel. "This isn't a place for conspiracy theories. Submit your concerns in writing." The meeting ended abruptly, and as I left, Paul Morrison whispered, "You need to be careful which path you choose." "Is that a threat?" I asked. "It's friendly advice," he said, his gaze hard. "Some sleeping dogs are best left alone." After the meeting, the hostility erupted. The next morning, I found "Mind Your Business" painted in red on my door, the smell of fresh paint mixing with the stench of trash strewn across my garden. My flowers were dead, likely from bleach. I showed photos to Dr. Harrison, who called the sheriff, but Dorothy said, "Maybe Kiara should think if this job's right for her." Harrison tried to mediate, but the pressure was clear. Deputy Martinez arrived, but his attitude had shifted. "Have you done anything to upset people?" he asked. "Like asking about my tax dollars," I replied. "Just saying, small towns have their ways. Sometimes it's better to let them sort things out." "You're not going to investigate?" I asked. "I'll file a report," he said, but his tone was resigned. My isolation became total. At Miller's Market, Bob refused me service. "We don't serve troublemakers." I had to drive 45 minutes to buy groceries, but someone started putting sugar in my gas tank, damaging my car. The local mechanic, Sam, was too busy. My phone had technical issues. Calls dropped. Internet failed. At the clinic, Dorothy turned openly hostile, forgetting messages and making snide comments in front of patients. Harrison asked, "Are you happy here?" I knew what he meant. It was my chance to leave before they fired me. "I want to stay," I said, though anger and fear battled inside me. Desperate, I went back to Rose. "I need to know what Martha Hardman found," I said. "It's worse than financial corruption," she replied, after a long pause. Martha found evidence that Mayor Kowalski and several council members took bribes from a mining company wanting to open a copper mine in the mountains. Bribes to change zoning laws, ignore environmental studies, fast-track permits. The mine would bring jobs, but pollute Millbrook's and other towns' drinking water. "They approved it," Rose said. "It's been operating for 2 years, but they keep it secret. No environmental oversight, no inspections, no chemical reports." Martha had evidence, financial records, recordings, photos. But when she left, they ransacked her house, taking everything. "That's why they fear you. They think you might uncover the same, follow the money, expose the conspiracy." The next night, I was working late at the clinic when my car alarm went off. I ran to the parking lot, but only saw shadows fleeing into the dark. My car was wrecked, tires slashed, windshield shattered, the interior covered in motor oil that reeked of stale gasoline. Under the wiper was a note. "Last warning. Leave or face the consequences." Fear consumed me. This wasn't just vandalism, it was a death threat. I called Martinez, but he only said, "No witnesses, no evidence." His disinterest was clear. That night, I called Rose. "They trashed my car and left a threatening note," I told her. "You have to leave," she replied, her voice trembling. But before giving up, I made 3 calls to the FBI in Billings, reporting environmental crimes and corruption, to the EPA, reporting the illegal mine, and to a journalist at the Great Falls Tribune, telling her everything. "I need evidence," the journalist said. "I'll give you what I have, but you'll need to dig deeper," I replied. The next morning, I found a dead dog on my porch, a German Shepherd I recognized as a family's pet from town. Tied to its collar was a note, "You're next." The smell of blood and death filled the air, and I knew I couldn't stay. I packed a suitcase, rented a car, and left Millbrook that afternoon, without saying goodbye to anyone, not even Rose. I drove to Portland, staying with a friend while trying to rebuild my life. Weeks later, I learned what happened. The FBI investigated, but found no evidence of the mine. The site Rose mentioned was just pristine forest. The EPA found nothing either. The journalist visited Millbrook, but no one talked, and she found no proof. "It's like someone tipped them off," she told me. "Everything was clean, the stories coordinated. My calls were likely intercepted. In a small town, the phone system isn't sophisticated. By alerting the authorities, I gave the conspirators time to erase evidence. I never returned to Millbrook. I found work in Seattle, trying to leave the terror behind, but I never understood why they hated me so much. Was it just Martha's house? Did they fear I'd uncover their secrets? Or was it something deeper, a town protecting its corruption at any cost? They succeeded. I left, and I never learned the real reason they didn't want me. But I know Millbrook is a place where laws don't matter, where a town can become a dark kingdom with its own rules, and where truth is a luxury you can't afford. My name is Pablo. I'm 31 years old, and my wife and I moved into our first home 4 years ago, chasing the American dream we so desperately wanted. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how our paradise turned into a nightmare that we still live with day by day. Sarah and I had been saving for 5 years for the down payment on our first house. We lived in a small apartment in Denver, working double shifts, I as a telecommunications technician and she as a registered nurse, sacrificing vacations, dinners out, and any luxuries to scrape together the $40,000 we needed. When we finally found the perfect house in Millfield, Colorado, a small town about 2 hours west of Denver, it felt like we'd won the lottery. It was a ranch-style house from the 1960s with 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, a large backyard, and a spectacular view of the Rocky Mountains. The price was unbelievably reasonable compared to Denver, and the town seemed the ideal place to start a family. "It's perfect," I told Sarah as we walked through the empty house during our second visit. "Quiet, safe, beautiful. Exactly what we were looking for." Millfield had a population of just 3,200 people, surrounded by cattle ranches and national forests. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and kids could ride bikes without supervision. Or so we thought. The purchase went smoothly in March of 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning. In hindsight, maybe we should have taken that as a warning sign. We moved in April, during the height of the lockdowns. Sarah had managed to transfer to the county hospital in Millfield, and I could work remotely for my telecom company, so the timing seemed perfect. The house needed some cosmetic fixes, but nothing major. We spent the first few weeks painting, installing laminate flooring, and getting to know our new home. It was exactly the life we dreamed of: quiet, productive, full of possibilities. Our immediate neighbors were the Hendersons to the left, an older couple who seemed friendly but distant, and the Morrisons to the right. The Morrisons' house was a bit closer to ours than I would have liked, separated by only about 6 yards and a low wooden fence. But the property was beautiful, and the price had been right. My first real encounter with the Morrisons was a week after we moved in. I was in the backyard, measuring for a small deck I wanted to build, when I heard a voice behind me. "You, the new neighbor?" I turned to see a man of about 40 years old, tall and thin, with dirty blonde hair and an unkempt beard. He was standing right at the property line, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Yeah, I'm Pablo," I said, walking over with my hand extended. "My wife Sarah and I moved in last week." He looked at my hand, but didn't shake it. "Rick Morrison," he said. "I live next door." "Great. Guess we're neighbors then," I said, keeping my tone friendly, despite his obvious coldness. "You lived here long?" "My whole life," he replied. "My family's owned this property for 3 generations." There was something about the way he said, "my family," that felt possessive, almost territorial. "It's a beautiful area," I commented. "We're really excited to be here." Rick studied me for a moment longer, then pointed to where I'd been measuring. "What are you planning to do there?" "Oh, just a small deck. Nothing fancy. Just a place to sit and enjoy the view." "You got permits for that?" The question caught me off guard. "Well, I haven't applied for any yet. I'm still in the planning phase. You're gonna need permits," he said, "and you'll need to make sure it's within the required setbacks. We don't want any code issues." "Of course," I said. "I'll definitely follow all the proper procedures." Rick nodded, but didn't seem satisfied. "Just make sure you do," he said, then turned and walked back to his house without another word. That night, I told Sarah about the encounter. "Maybe he's just cautious about new neighbors," she suggested. "Some people need time to warm up." She was right, of course. Not everyone is immediately friendly, especially in small towns where families have lived for generations. I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. Over the next few weeks, I had several more encounters with Rick Morrison, and each one left me more uneasy than the last. He seemed to always be outside when I was working in the yard, watching what I was doing. Not overtly, he'd pretend to be gardening or working on his truck, but I could feel his eyes on me constantly. One day, I was installing a new sprinkler in the front yard when he appeared in his driveway. "That sprinkler gonna spray onto my property?" he asked without preamble. "No," I said. "It's set to cover just our lawn." "You'd better make sure it is," he replied. "I don't want your water on my land." The way he said, "your water and my land," had an aggressive edge that put me on the defensive. "Rick," I said, trying to keep my tone reasonable, "I definitely don't intend to cause any issues. If there's ever a problem, just let me know, and I'll fix it." "There'll be a problem if that sprinkler touches my property," he said, then went inside. That night, Sarah and I discussed the situation. "Maybe you should talk to him," she suggested. "Explain we're good people, that we're not here to cause trouble." "I've tried being friendly," I said. "He's the one being hostile." "Give him time," Sarah said. "Maybe he just needs to get used to having new neighbors." But things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. Rick started complaining about everything we did. If I mowed the lawn after 8 in the morning on a Saturday, he'd show up to tell me it was too early. If Sarah played music while gardening, he complained it was too loud. If we had friends over for a barbecue, he complained about the smoke and noise. But the most disturbing thing was the way he watched us. Sarah started noticing it too. "Pablo," she told me one night, "I think Rick is spying on us." "What do you mean?" "I was reading in the backyard today, and when I looked over at his house, he was standing at his second-floor window, watching me with binoculars." "Are you sure?" "Completely sure. When he saw me looking, he stepped away from the window fast. That was more than antisocial behavior. It was invasive and creepy. The first real incident happened in June, about 2 months after we moved in. I'd ordered lumber for the deck I finally decided to build after getting all the necessary permits. The delivery truck arrived on a Tuesday morning and unloaded the wood in our driveway. I was at work when Sarah called me, clearly upset. "Pablo, you need to come home," she said. "What happened?" "Rick moved all our lumber." "What do you mean he moved it?" "All the wood that was supposed to be in our driveway is now stacked in his yard. And when I asked him about it, he said it was delivered to his property by mistake." "That's ridiculous. I was here when I measured to make sure the truck could fit in our driveway." "I know, but he's insisting it's his wood now." I drove home immediately. Sure enough, all my lumber, easily worth $800, was now neatly stacked in Rick's yard. I went straight to his front door and knocked. "Rick," I said, when he opened the door, "you need to give me back my lumber." "Your lumber?" he said with a look of feigned confusion. "That wood was delivered to my property." "It was delivered to my property, and you moved it. I have the receipts. I have the work order. I have photos of the delivery truck in my driveway." "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "That wood was delivered here." It was a blatant lie, and we both knew it. "Rick, this is theft. Give me back my lumber, or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," he said with a smirk. "Call the police. But that wood's on my property, which means it's mine." I called the police. The deputy sheriff who responded was a young man named Officer Chen, who seemed competent but overwhelmed by the situation. "Let me get this straight," he said, after hearing both sides. "Mr. Ramirez, you say you ordered wood that was delivered to your property, and Mr. Morrison, you say the wood was delivered to your property." Correct, we both said. Any documentation? I showed him my receipts, the work order, and the photos I'd taken of the delivery truck. And Mr. Morrison, do you have any documentation? I don't need documentation, Rick said. The wood's on my property. Officer Chen looked uncomfortable. Look, he said, technically, if the wood's on Mr. Morrison's property and he's claiming ownership, this could be a civil matter rather than criminal. Are you telling me someone can steal my property and get away with it just because they moved it to their yard? I asked. I'm saying that, without witnesses to the actual movement of the wood, this could be a property boundary dispute issue. It was unbelievable. Rick had literally stolen my lumber in broad daylight, and the police weren't going to do anything about it. Officer Chen, I said, I have neighbors who might have seen something. Can you ask them? Sure, we can try that. But when Officer Chen spoke to the Hendersons, they said they hadn't seen anything. When he spoke to other neighbors, they all said the same. Rick kept my lumber. After the lumber incident, Rick got bolder in his harassment. He started calling the code enforcement department over everything. If we left our trash bins out a day longer than allowed, he reported us. If we parked our car 5 inches too close to the property line, he reported us. If our lawn was an inch too long, he reported us. Each time, we had to deal with code enforcement officers, explain the situation, and sometimes pay fines for things that were barely infractions. But that was just the start. Rick also began what I can only describe as psychological warfare. He installed bright floodlights pointed directly at our windows, making it impossible to sleep. When we complained, he said he needed the lights for security. He started mowing his lawn at 6 in the morning on Sundays, using the loudest mower I'd ever heard. When we complained, he said he had a right to mow his lawn whenever he wanted. He set up speakers in his backyard and played annoying music, not loud enough to violate noise ordinances, but enough to disrupt any outdoor activity we tried to enjoy. More disturbing, he started taking pictures of us. If we were in our backyard, he'd show up with a camera and start snapping photos. When we confronted him, he said he was documenting property line violations. Sarah started feeling unsafe in our own home. I can't relax anymore, she told me. Every time I go outside, he's watching. Every time I'm in the house, I feel like he's taking pictures. I contacted a lawyer to see what our options were, but the news wasn't good. Unfortunately, the lawyer told me, most of what you're describing is annoying but not illegal. Taking photos from his own property is legal. Making noise during the day is legal. Installing lights on his own property is legal, but he's clearly harassing us. Harassment is hard to prove legally unless there are direct threats or clearly illegal behavior. What you're describing sounds more like a neighbor dispute, so there's nothing we can do. You could try mediation, or you could document everything and hope he escalates to something clearly illegal. I didn't like either option. What made it worse was that other people in the town started treating us differently. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but gradually, it became clear that Rick had been talking to others about us, spreading stories that painted us as troublemakers. At the grocery store, workers who'd once been friendly turned cold and distant. At the gas station, the attendant barely acknowledged us. At restaurants, service became slow and indifferent. Sarah experienced it at the hospital too. Some of my co-workers have been asking weird questions, she told me. Questions about whether we're fitting in with the community, if we understand how things work here. What kind of questions? Like, yesterday, one of the other nurses asked if we were planning to cause trouble for longtime residents. When I asked what she meant, she said she'd heard we were difficult neighbors who didn't respect property rights. It was clear Rick had been spreading lies about us all over town. I tried to counter those stories by being extra friendly and helpful whenever possible. I volunteered for community events, donated to local charities, and made an effort to be a model citizen. But Rick's campaign against us was persistent and effective. Little by little, more and more people in the town started looking at us with suspicion and hostility. In August, things escalated beyond psychological harassment. I was working in the backyard when I noticed someone had been on our property overnight. Several of our plants had been damaged, not by animals, but by someone with tools. Clean cuts on stems, holes dug in flower beds, decorative stones moved or stolen. At first, I thought it might have been teenagers or random vandalism, but when I examined the damage closer, I noticed all the incidents had happened in areas visible from Rick's house, but not from the street or other neighbors' homes. That night, I set up motion-activated cameras around our yard. 3 days later, I had my answer. The cameras caught Rick Morrison trespassing on our property at 2 in the morning, systematically damaging plants and lawn decorations. Finally, I had proof. I took the video evidence to the police immediately. "This is clearly trespassing and property damage," I told Officer Chen. "I want to press charges." Officer Chen watched the video, and his expression was grim. "This is definitely criminal behavior," he agreed. "We'll issue a warrant for Mr. Morrison's arrest." Rick was arrested the next day and charged with criminal trespass and destruction of property. I felt vindicated. Finally, the authorities would see what kind of person Rick Morrison really was. But my relief was short-lived. Rick's arrest caused an uproar in the community. To my shock, most people seemed to think I had gone too far. "Rick Morrison's a good guy," people told me. "His family's lived here for generations. He wouldn't do something like that unless he had a good reason." Some suggested I had provoked him somehow. Others hinted the video might have been faked or taken out of context. The local paper ran an article about the incident that portrayed Rick as a prominent community member who'd been unfairly targeted by newcomers who don't understand local ways. Rick hired an expensive lawyer from Denver who got the charges reduced to minor trespass. He received no jail time, just probation and a small fine. But the legal case had an unintended consequence. It made Rick even bolder. After the court case, Rick's behavior became even more aggressive and coordinated. He recruited others in the community to join in the harassment. Suddenly, we weren't just dealing with Rick Morrison, but with an organized campaign involving several neighbors. Our trash started appearing scattered across our yard every week. Packages disappeared from our doorstep. Our mailbox was vandalized repeatedly. Cars parked outside our house at all hours, with people inside taking photos or just watching. Anonymous notes were left at our door. "You don't belong here. Leave while you can. We don't want your kind here." Sarah started having panic attacks. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work, and couldn't enjoy any part of our home life. "Pablo," she told me one night, "maybe we should leave. Sell the house and move somewhere else." "No," I said, though I was starting to feel defeated too. "This is our house. We worked 5 years to pay for it. I'm not letting these people drive us out." But privately, I was beginning to wonder if the fight was worth it. Determined to understand why Rick Morrison and the community were so hostile toward us, I started digging. I researched the history of our property and found something interesting. Our house had been built in the 1960s on land that was originally part of the Morrison family ranch. Digging deeper, I learned that Rick's grandfather had been forced to sell the land during the Great Depression to pay off debts. The land had changed hands several times over the decades before being subdivided for residential development. In Rick's mind, we were living on land stolen from his family. I also discovered this wasn't the first time Rick had harassed neighbors. Over the past 20 years, there had been multiple complaints filed against him by previous owners, but each time the complaints had been dropped or resolved amicably, which I suspected meant the families had simply moved away rather than keep fighting. Rick Morrison had systematically driven out every family that had tried to live on his family's former land, and now it was our turn. With this knowledge, I had to make a decision. I could keep fighting, knowing Rick would never stop harassing us, and that the community would continue to side with him over us, or I could accept defeat and move, like all the previous families had done. Sarah and I discussed it at length. "I hate the idea of letting him win," she said, "but I also hate feeling scared in our own home. If we leave, he'll just do the same to the next family that moves in. But if we stay, what kind of life will we have?" It was a good point. Even if we managed to endure Rick's harassment, was it worth living in constant stress and conflict? I consulted lawyers about our options. Could we get a restraining order? Could we sue for harassment? Could we force Rick to leave us alone? The answers were discouraging. Without direct threats of violence, restraining orders were hard to obtain. Harassment laws varied and were tough to enforce. Civil lawsuits were expensive and uncertain. "Honestly," one lawyer told me, "your best option might be to move. I know it's not what you want to hear, but sometimes discretion is the better part of valor." In the end, Sarah and I decided to stay and fight. We installed extensive security systems around our property. We documented every harassment incident. We filed complaints with every relevant authority. Most importantly, we refused to be intimidated. Over time, Rick's harassment began to taper off. I think he realized we weren't going to be driven out easily, and maybe he got tired of the constant conflict. The community's hostility also started to fade as people got used to our presence and realized we weren't troublemakers. We began making real friends with some neighbors. We got involved with local organizations and charities. Slowly, we found a place for ourselves in Millfield. Rick still lives next door. We still have occasional conflicts. Sometimes I catch him watching us from his windows. Sometimes he still files frivolous complaints against us with the Code Enforcement Department. But the intense harassment campaign has largely ended. We've learned to coexist, if not peacefully, at least without constant warfare. 4 years later, Sarah and I are still living in our house in Millfield. We've made improvements. We added the deck I originally planned, fixed up the yard, and made the place truly ours. We've learned to navigate the complexities of small-town life. We know which people to avoid and which are genuinely friendly. We know which battles are worth fighting and which to let go. Rick Morrison still lives next door, and we occasionally still have issues with him. Last month, he complained to the Code Enforcement Department because our new fence was supposedly 5 inches too close to the property line. It wasn't. A few weeks ago, he accused us of letting our dog bark too much. We don't have a dog. But these incidents are minor compared to the systematic harassment we endured during our first year. I think Rick has accepted that we're not going anywhere, and he's moved on to other obsessions. Sarah has thrived at her job at the hospital and has become a respected member of the medical community. I've built a successful consulting business that lets me work from home while staying connected to my industry. We're planning to start a family soon, and surprisingly, the idea of raising kids here no longer scares us. We've learned that most people in Millfield are good people, even if they were initially suspicious of newcomers. but we've also learned to stay vigilant. We keep our security systems up. We document any unusual incidents. We stay attuned to Rick's moods and behavior patterns. Living next to someone who's proven capable of sustained harassment requires constant vigilance. You can't fully relax. You can't fully trust that the problem is over. Rick Morrison is now 63 years old. Sometimes I wonder what will happen when he dies or can no longer maintain his obsessive watch over his family land. Will his children inherit his grudges? Will whoever buys his house understand the complicated history? Or will his death finally free us completely from the shadow that's hung over our home since the day we moved in? For now, we live day by day, enjoying the life we've built while staying prepared for whatever Rick Morrison might do next. My name is Jose, and what I'm about to tell you changed my life forever. For 3 years, I haven't slept well, and every time I hear footsteps in the hallway of my home, my heart races as if it's going to burst out of my chest. But I'd better start from the beginning, because to understand my terror, you need to know how I got here. All my life, I lived in London, in the same neighborhood where I grew up. I worked in an insurance office, had my routine, my friends at the corner pub, and a predictable, orderly life. But London became suffocating after my mother died. The constant noise, the crowds, the memories on every corner. I needed a radical change. It was my sister who told me about Little Thornwick, a tiny village in Yorkshire that barely shows up on maps. "It's perfect for you, Jose," she said. "Quiet, peaceful, people know each other. You'll be able to write that novel you've always said you would." She was right. I'd been talking for years about leaving everything to write, but I'd never had the courage. When I saw the house for the first time, I knew it was the right place. A stone cottage from the 18th century, with a backyard facing the Yorkshire fields, 2 bedrooms, a working fireplace, and most importantly, it was at the end of Elm Street, almost isolated, with only one house next door. It was exactly the solitude I was looking for. The move was simple. I didn't have many possessions, just a few pieces of furniture, my books, my computer, and my mother's inheritance, which allowed me to live modestly without working for a while. The first day in Little Thornwick felt like breathing fresh air after years underwater. It was that first afternoon when I met Harold. I was unpacking boxes in the front garden when I heard a voice behind me. "New to the neighborhood?" I turned and saw an older man, perhaps around 70 years old, thin but sturdy, with neatly combed gray hair and strikingly clear blue eyes. He wore a gray wool sweater and corduroy trousers, like something out of a British postcard. "Yes, just moved in," I replied, wiping my hands on my jeans. "I'm Jose." "Harold Patterson," he said, extending a firm hand. "I live right next door. Welcome to Little Thornwick." His smile was warm, genuine. He had that reassuring presence some older men have, as if they'd seen enough of the world to remain unfazed by anything. He asked where I was from, what brought me to the village, and when I told him about my plan to write, his eyes lit up. "Marvelous. A writer in the neighborhood. We haven't had one in years. You must tell me more over dinner. My wife Dorothy makes the best Sunday roast in the county, and that's how it all began." The first dinner at Harold and Dorothy's was exactly what I needed after weeks of takeaway food and solitude. Dorothy was a petite woman with silver hair tied in a bun, rosy cheeks, and a contagious laugh. Their house smelled of cinnamon and firewood, filled with family photos and the warmth that only comes from decades of a happy marriage. "Harold couldn't stop talking about you," Dorothy told me as she served roast lamb with potatoes and vegetables. "He says you're a writer. What kind of stories do you write?" "Well, I'm just starting," I admitted. "I want to write something about rural life, maybe a psychological thriller set in a small village." Harold chuckled. "Be careful with that, lad. Small villages have more secrets than you'd think." I thought it was a typical village joke, but something in his tone made me wonder if he was serious. Dorothy gave him a playful nudge. "Don't mind Harold. He likes to play mysterious." The conversation flowed naturally. Harold told me he'd been a history teacher at the local secondary school until his retirement 10 years ago. Dorothy had worked at the village library. They had no children. "We never could," Dorothy explained with a sad smile, "but they'd looked after many of the village's children over the years. That first dinner became a weekly tradition, then twice weekly, and eventually Harold started inviting me almost every day. A single man shouldn't eat alone, he'd insist. Besides, Dorothy cooks for an army out of habit." Over time, our friendship deepened. Harold became my literary confidant, the first to read my early chapters. He had a brilliant mind, knew local history like no one else, and helped me with details that made my stories more authentic. "If you want to write about small villages," he'd say, while we reviewed my notes, "you have to understand that here, everyone knows everyone's secrets, but we also know when to keep our mouths shut." During those first months, Little Thornwick felt like the home I never knew I needed. Mornings began with coffee in my garden, writing while listening to birdsong. Afternoons were spent exploring the surrounding fields, gathering details for my stories. And evenings, almost always, were spent with Harold and Dorothy. Harold had an impressive library. He'd collected local history books for decades, many of them first editions or rare manuscripts. He lent me books on Yorkshire's history, famous regional criminal cases, and local legends. "Reality always outdoes fiction," he'd say, "especially in places like this, where families have lived for generations and secrets pile up like dust in the attic." It was during one of those afternoons, about 6 months after my move, when Harold showed me his most prized collection, a series of scrapbooks filled with newspaper clippings he'd been compiling for years. "My little obsession," he explained, opening the first one. "Unsolved criminal cases from Yorkshire. I've always been fascinated by mysteries. We spent hours going through yellowed clippings, cases of missing persons, strange thefts, mysterious deaths. Harold knew every detail of every case, had investigated on his own, and had his own theories. "Look at this one," he said, pointing to an article from 1987. "Sarah Mitchell, 23 years old, disappeared on her way home from work. They never found the body, never arrested anyone. She lived just 20 kilometers from here." His knowledge was encyclopedic, but what struck me was the way he talked about the cases. It wasn't the typical morbid curiosity of someone fascinated by crime, but something more intimate, as if he knew them from the inside. "How do you know so much about these cases?" I asked. Harold shrugged. "When you're a history teacher, you develop detective instincts. Plus, some of these cases I covered when they were fresh news. My memory doesn't fail me." That night, I walked home with an odd feeling, as if I'd seen something I shouldn't have, but I chalked it up to my writer's imagination, always looking for stories where there were none. Winter came early that year. The evenings grew longer and darker, and I spent even more time with Harold and Dorothy. It was during those nights, sitting by the fireplace after dinner, that Harold told me his most interesting stories. "Have I told you about the Emma Thornbridge case?" he asked one December night, while Dorothy knitted quietly. He hadn't, so I settled into the armchair to listen. It was in 1982. A young woman from Sheffield who came to the village to visit an aunt. She stayed at the bed and breakfast that used to be where the pharmacy is now. They found her 3 days later in Whitmore Wood, about 5 kilometers from here. His voice took on an almost hypnotic tone as he described the details. How she was found, the state of the body, the police theories, why the case was never solved. The police thought it was someone local, Harold continued. Someone who knew the area, who knew where to hide a body. But they could never prove it. Dorothy looked up from her knitting. Harold, enough with those gruesome stories. Poor Jose will have nightmares. Harold laughed. I'm just giving him material for his stories. Writers need inspiration, don't they, Jose? I nodded, but the truth was I felt uneasy. There was something about the way Harold told these cases, a precision in the details that seemed to go beyond academic interest. That night, back at my house, I looked up Emma Thornbridge online. I found only a brief mention in the Yorkshire Post archives. Harold was right about the basic facts, but the details he'd added about the state of the body, the specific police theories, weren't mentioned anywhere. I told myself he'd probably spoken to retired police officers or had access to undigitized archives. After all, he'd lived in the area his whole life. But I started paying closer attention. The next time Harold brought out his scrapbooks, I observed more carefully. There were patterns I hadn't noticed before. Most of the cases involved young women. All had disappeared or been killed within a 50-kilometer radius of Little Thornwick, and all the dates clustered in certain periods: 1982 to 1985, 1991 to 1993, 1994 to 1997, 97 to 1999. Harold, I asked one afternoon, trying to sound casual, how did you get so many details about these cases? Some of these clippings are very basic, but you know information that isn't here. His blue eyes fixed on me for a moment that felt eternal. As I told you, when something fascinates you, you dig deeper. I spoke to police, families, witnesses. It's surprising what people tell you. If you ask the right way, his answer was logical, but something in his tone made me feel like I was being evaluated. It was in February when I started noticing other strange details. One night, during dinner, Harold casually mentioned he was going to visit his sister in Leeds the following weekend. But the next day, when I stopped by to return a book, I saw his car in the garage. Dorothy explained that Harold had cancelled the trip because he wasn't feeling well. Another time, Harold told me a detailed story about teaching at the local secondary school for 30 years. But when I mentioned this at the village pharmacy, Mrs. Henderson corrected me. Oh no, dear. Harold never taught at our school. He worked in Bradford, I believe. He only came here on weekends until he retired. Small inconsistencies that, individually, meant nothing but started piling up in my mind. What really disturbed me was what happened one night in March. Harold and I had drunk more wine than usual during dinner, and he was particularly talkative about his favorite cases. Dorothy had gone to bed early with a headache, so we were alone in the living room. Jose, he said, looking at me with slightly glassy eyes from the alcohol, have you ever killed? The question caught me completely off guard. What? Not literally, he laughed, but his laugh sounded forced. I mean, in your stories. Have you had to get inside the mind of a killer to write? Well, yeah. It's part of the creative process, I guess. And how do you do it? How do you imagine what someone feels when they take a life? The intensity of his gaze made me uncomfortable. I don't know. I guess I try to understand the motivations, the emotions. Harold leaned forward. Do you think they feel remorse? Or do you think some enjoy it so much it becomes addictive? Harold, you've had too much to drink. You're right. He straightened in his chair. Dorothy always says, I don't know when to stop. He changed the subject abruptly, but for the rest of the night, I felt like I was being studied. That conversation haunted me for days. I started paying attention to other seemingly innocent comments Harold made. His fascination with the details of how victims had died. His theory about why certain cases were never solved, because the killer was smarter than the police. His detailed knowledge of forensic techniques from different decades. And then there were his absences. I'd noticed that Harold would disappear periodically for several days. Dorothy always had explanations, doctor visits in Leeds, trips to see old colleagues, excursions to buy rare books in York. But the dates never matched what Harold had told me before. One night in April, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until I saw the lights in Harold's house go out, then went to my backyard. From there, I had a clear view of his garage and the path leading to the woods behind our houses. I didn't know what I expected to see, but I stayed there for hours, watching. Most nights nothing happened, but that night, around 2 a.m, I saw a figure leave Harold's house. It was him, no doubt. Even in the dark, I recognized his walk. He was carrying something, a bag or sack, and headed toward the woods. He returned 3 hours later, without the bag. From that night on, I started watching regularly. Not every night, but on the ones Harold had mentioned, he'd be out of town. On 5 occasions over the next month, I saw him leave in the early hours toward the woods, always carrying something, always returning without it. The 6th time, I decided to follow him. It was a moonless night in May, perfect for going unnoticed. Harold left at 2:15 in the morning, as he had before. This time, he carried what looked like a shovel in addition to the usual bag. I followed at a safe distance, using the trees for cover. I knew these woods well after months of walks, but Harold moved with the confidence of someone who'd taken this path many times before. We walked for nearly 20 minutes until we reached a clearing I'd never seen. Harold stopped by a large oak and began digging. From my hiding spot behind some bushes, I watched him work for over an hour. The hole he dug wasn't large, maybe a yard by a yard, but it was deep. When he finished, he opened the bag he'd brought and took out something that made my blood run cold. It was clothing. Women's clothing, stained with something dark I didn't want to imagine. Harold placed the clothing in the hole carefully, as if it were something precious. Then he filled the hole, tamped down the earth, and covered the area with leaves and branches until there was no trace he'd dug there. When Harold started heading back, I'd already run home. I spent the rest of the night awake, trembling, trying to process what I'd seen. Had I witnessed Harold hiding evidence of a crime? Was that clothing from a victim? Or was there an innocent explanation my rattled mind couldn't see? For the next few days, I tried to act normal around Harold, but it was nearly impossible. Every time he smiled, I wondered if it was the smile of a killer. Every time he told a story about unsolved cases, I wondered if he was speaking from personal experience. I stopped accepting his dinner invitations as often, claiming I needed to focus on my writing. But Harold was persistent. "You haven't been coming around as much lately," he said one afternoon when he found me in my garden. "Dorothy's worried. Did we do something to upset you?" The concern in his voice sounded genuine, which made everything even more confusing. "No, not at all. I've just been busy with my book, glad to hear it. How's the story about the small village going? Found a good mystery to solve?" The irony of his question hit me like a fist. "Yeah, I think so." "Excellent. You must tell me more tonight at dinner. Dorothy's making your favorite stew I couldn't decline without seeming suspicious. So that night, I went to their house, as I'd always done. But everything felt different. Every smile from Harold seemed calculated. Every question about my book felt like a way to gauge how much I knew. It was during that dinner that Harold told me about the Lisa Hartwell case. She disappeared in 1998, he said, as Dorothy served dessert. A girl from Manchester who came hiking in the Yorkshire Dales never made it back to her hotel. As always, Harold knew details that didn't appear in the papers. He knew what she'd carried in her backpack, what route she'd planned to take, even what she'd eaten for breakfast on her last morning. "How do you know all that?" I asked, no longer caring if I sounded suspicious. Harold looked at me for a long moment. "As I've told you, Jose, when something fascinates you, you dig deep." That night when I got home, I looked up Lisa Hartwell. I found a brief article about her disappearance, but nothing more. However, what I did find was a pattern that took my breath away. Every one of the victims Harold had mentioned over the months, Emma Thornbridge, Sarah Mitchell, Lisa Hartwell, and at least 6 others, had disappeared during periods when Harold had supposedly been out of town. I spent the whole night checking dates, cross-referencing information. The pattern was undeniable. Every time Harold was absent for several days, there was a disappearance or an unsolved murder somewhere in Yorkshire. By dawn, I had to face the horrific truth. My friend, the man who'd welcomed me like a grandfather, who'd shared hundreds of dinners with me, was very likely a serial killer. But what could I do with this information? I had no concrete evidence, just correlations and suspicions. The police would take me for a paranoid writer with too much imagination. I decided I needed more evidence. I had to go back to the woods and find that clearing where Harold had buried the clothing. I waited until the next weekend, when Harold and Dorothy had supposedly gone to visit a cousin in Harrogate. I took a small shovel, a flashlight, and my phone to document anything I found. Finding the clearing was harder than I expected. Everything looked different in daylight, and I'd taken several wrong paths before recognizing the large oak where Harold had dug. The area looked untouched, covered with leaves and branches as Harold had left it. I began digging carefully, following the pattern I remembered from that night. About 2 feet deep, my shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. It was a plastic bag, carefully sealed. Inside was women's clothing, a blue blouse, jeans, underwear, all stained with what was clearly dried blood. There was also something else, a necklace with a small silver cross and a driver's license. The license belonged to Jennifer Walsh, 24 years old, with an address in Birmingham. The photo showed a smiling young woman with short blonde hair. With trembling hands, I photographed everything with my phone before reburying the bag exactly as I'd found it. I needed time to think about what to do with this information. That night, I looked up Jennifer Walsh. She had disappeared 3 months earlier while visiting Yorkshire. Local papers had briefly covered her disappearance, but the case seemed to have gone cold quickly. 3 months earlier, exactly when Harold had taken one of his mysterious trips to Leeds. For the next few days, I tried to act normal, but it was nearly impossible. Harold seemed to notice my nervousness. "You've been quiet lately," he said during one of our usual dinners. "Everything okay with your book?" "Yeah, just stuck on a tricky part of the plot." "Oh? Tell me about it. Maybe I can help." The smile on his face made me feel sick. "It's about a serial killer living in a small village. Nobody suspects him because he's a respected community member." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. And how does the protagonist plan to catch him?" "I haven't decided yet." "Well," Harold said, cutting a piece of meat with surgical precision, "I hope it's realistic. Smart killers are rarely caught by amateur protagonists. In real life, they just disappear, or they eliminate threats to their peace." The silence that followed was deafening. Dorothy kept eating as if nothing had happened, but I knew Harold had sent me a message. That night, I decided I had to go to the police, no matter how unbelievable my story sounded. But when I woke the next morning, I found a note someone had slipped under my door. "Jose, I hope you're sleeping well. The woods can be dangerous at night, especially for curious writers. H." Harold knew I'd followed him. He knew I'd found the evidence, and he was warning me. That morning, I packed a suitcase with essentials and drove to York, where I checked into a hotel under a false name. From there, I called the Yorkshire police and reported everything I knew. Detective Sarah Thompson, who took my statement, was professional, but skeptical. "Mr. Martinez, these are very serious accusations. Are you willing to guide our officers to the location where you say you found evidence?" "Yes, but I don't want to go back to the village alone. If I'm right, Harold Patterson is extremely dangerous." "Understood. We'll send a team tomorrow morning." The excavation in the woods confirmed my worst fears. They not only found the bag with Jennifer Walsh's clothing and belongings, but also 3 more bags buried in the area, each containing evidence of different victims. Harold was arrested that afternoon at his home. Dorothy, I was told later, had been completely unaware of her husband's activities. The early dementia she'd begun showing in recent months had shielded her from the horrific truth. The trial lasted 6 months. The evidence was overwhelming. In addition to what was found in the woods, the search of Harold's house revealed an elaborate filing system where he'd meticulously documented each of his crimes over more than 30 years. The scrapbooks he'd shown me so proudly weren't just his hobby, they were trophies. Many of the unsolved cases that had fascinated him included handwritten notes in the margins, correcting inaccurate details in the news reports. Harold was convicted of 9 confirmed murders, though the police suspect the actual number could be much higher. During the trial, he maintained his affable professor demeanor, even as evidence of his crimes was presented. Only once did our eyes meet across the courtroom, and the smile he gave me was the same one I'd seen hundreds of times during our dinners. What disturbs me most, even now, is remembering all those nights I spent in his house, eating Dorothy's food, listening to his stories, considering him a mentor and friend. How many times had he come back from killing someone and gone straight to inviting me to dinner? How many times had he washed blood off his hands before shaking mine? After the trial, I sold the house in Little Thornwick and returned to London. I couldn't write for nearly a year. Every time I tried to create a character, I saw Harold's face. Every time I tried to write dialogue, I heard his voice telling me about his favorite cases. Dorothy died 6 months after Harold's arrest. The doctor said it was her heart, but I believe it was the betrayal. Living with someone for 60 years and discovering they were a monster must have been more than her heart could bear. I've spoken to psychologists about my experience. They've explained how psychopaths can be charming, manipulative, capable of maintaining perfect facades for decades. They've assured me there was no way I could have known that even trained professionals can be fooled. But that doesn't ease the guilt. What if I'd noticed the signs earlier? What if I'd investigated his inconsistencies sooner? Could I have saved Jennifer Walsh or the other victims whose bags were found later? What haunts me most is knowing that Harold enjoyed our friendship in a completely different way than I did. For me, he was a confidant, a surrogate father, a source of wisdom and warmth. For him, I was, what? A game, a challenge, a way to test how well he could hide his true nature. During the trial, it came to light that Harold had developed vascular dementia in his later years. His long-term memory was intact, but his ability to form new memories and control impulses was deteriorating. Forensic psychiatrists suggested this might explain why he'd become less careful, why he'd started sharing so many details about his favorite cases. His last victims had shown more disorganized, less calculated violence. The police believe that if he hadn't been caught when he was, his dementia would have led him to make increasingly bigger mistakes until he was inevitably discovered. Or perhaps he would have lost control entirely and attacked someone closer, someone like me. That possibility haunts me more than anything else. During all those months of friendship, was I ever in danger? Were the constant dinner invitations just hospitality, or was Harold evaluating me as a potential victim? In one of the last letters Harold sent me from prison, letters I never answered but couldn't stop reading, he wrote something that still keeps me awake. Jose, I hope you're well. I know my arrest must have been a shock to you. During all those months of friendship, I genuinely came to appreciate you. You were different from the other people I met. You had that writer's curiosity, that need to understand the darkest human motivations. In a way, you understood me better than anyone. I want you to know you were never in real danger. Well, not until the end. I had rules I followed, patterns I kept. But when you started asking questions, when I began to notice that different look in your eyes, I admit I considered all my options. The dementia is playing cruel tricks on me, Jose. Sometimes I forget where I am. Sometimes I relive past moments as if they're happening now. But there's one thing I remember with perfect clarity. The night I followed you, when you followed me into the woods. Yes, I knew. I saw you from the moment you left your house. You could say it was a game within a game. I wanted to see what you'd do with the knowledge. If you'd be smart enough to stay quiet, or brave enough, or foolish, to act. You did the right thing, of course, though part of me had hoped you'd come confront me directly. It would have been a fascinating conversation. In any case, I suppose we both got what we were looking for. You got your story, and I have all the time in the world to remember mine. Take care, my dear friend. The world is a dangerous place for those who know too much. Yours, Harold. That letter arrived 2 years ago. Since then, I've received 4 more, each more disturbing than the last. In the most recent one, Harold mentioned specific details about my current life, my new address in London, the cafe where I write, even the name of the woman I'd started dating. When I called the prison to complain, they told me Harold hadn't had contact with the outside world beyond the letters he sent me. His dementia had progressed to the point where most days he didn't remember where he was or why he was there. But, strangely, his memories of me remained vividly clear. It's common in vascular dementia, the prison psychiatrist explained during a phone call. Patients can lose the ability to form new memories, but retain certain specific past memories perfectly intact. Apparently, you made a significant impact on Mr. Patterson. That explanation didn't comfort me at all. What truly terrifies me isn't the letters themselves, but the implications of what they contain. If Harold was really watching me that night in the woods, if he knew all along that I suspected him, then our last weeks of friendship were something entirely different from what I'd thought. Every dinner, every conversation, every smile was part of a macabre game. Harold had been deciding whether to kill me, weighing the risk I posed, calculating his options, and I, completely oblivious, had kept sitting at his table, eating his food, trusting him. In his second-to-last letter, Harold wrote something that made me reevaluate our entire time together. Remember that night in March when you asked me how I got inside a killer's mind for my stories? Your face when I asked you that question about killing. It was perfect. The confusion, the barely concealed fear, the way you changed the subject. I knew then that you'd started to suspect something. That's when I decided to test what kind of person you really were. The next few weeks were a fascinating experiment. Would you run? Would you confront me? Or would you do exactly what you did? Investigate, gather evidence, act like the protagonist of one of your novels. I must admit, I was impressed. Not many people would have had the courage to follow me into the woods that night, nor would they have had the presence of mind to properly document what they found before going to the police. In a way, Jose, I'm proud of you. Like a teacher proud of an exceptional student, reading those words made me vomit. The idea that Harold felt proud of me, that he'd seen my terror as a form of entertainment, was more than I could bear. But the most recent letter, which arrived just 1 week ago, contained information that made me consider leaving the country. Jose, I've been thinking a lot lately about the early days of our friendship. Remember when you told me you wanted to write a psychological thriller set in a small village? You said you wanted to explore how secrets pile up in close-knit communities. Well, I'm pleased to know you finally found your story. But there's something you may not know, something that might be useful for future works. Little Thornwick has more secrets than you uncovered. Remember Mrs. Henderson from the pharmacy? She knows about the poisonous plants that grow in the local woods, knowledge that proved very useful in 1979. And Mr. Davies, who runs the post office, he has access to information about who receives what kind of mail, information I've used to identify potential victims for years. Oh, and Dorothy, my dear innocent Dorothy, do you really think a woman can live with someone for 60 years and know nothing? Dorothy knew exactly who I was. The dementia was a convenient act during the trial. The whole village knew, Jose. They all knew and kept quiet because I was useful. I got rid of the undesirable elements, the women who came from outside, asked inconvenient questions, threatened the peace of our little paradise. You were the only outsider who stayed long enough to uncover the truth. And now that you know it, well, I suppose you understand why you can never return to Little Thornwick. This final revelation shattered me completely. If Harold was telling the truth, I hadn't just been a victim of a serial killer, but of a conspiracy involving an entire village. Every friendly smile, every cordial greeting, every show of rural hospitality had been a lie. But could I trust the words of a man with advanced dementia? Or was this just another way to torment me? One last manipulation designed to destroy any positive memory I might have of my time there. There was no way to know, and that uncertainty was perhaps worse than the truth. 3 months ago, I decided to hire a private investigator to verify some of Harold's claims. The results were unsettling. Mrs. Henderson had previously worked as a lab technician in a hospital with access to a variety of chemicals. Mr. Davies had been discharged from the military under mysterious circumstances in the 1970s. And Dorothy, according to medical records the investigator obtained dubiously, had shown no signs of dementia until after Harold's arrest. More disturbing, the investigator found evidence that several Little Thornwick residents had received mysterious payments for years, regular bank transfers from an account belonging to Harold. Had he been paying them for their silence or for their active help? The investigator also uncovered something that chilled my blood. Over the past 30 years, no outsider who had come to live permanently in Little Thornwick had stayed for more than 2 years. They had all mysteriously disappeared, moved away suddenly without explanation, or suffered accidents that forced them to leave. I had been the first to stay long enough to uncover something, and now that I knew, I apparently could never return. These revelations have driven me to constant paranoia. Every time I leave my London apartment, I wonder if someone is following me. Every time I receive mail, I fear it's another letter from Harold. Every time I meet someone new, I wonder if they're somehow connected to Little Thornwick. Last week, while writing at my usual cafe, I noticed an older man reading a newspaper at a nearby table. When I looked up, he was staring at me. Our eyes met for a second before he returned to his paper, but something in his gaze made me feel like he'd recognized me. I left immediately and haven't returned to that cafe since. I know I'm probably being paranoid. I know my experience with Harold has warped my perception of the world, making me see threats where there are none. But I also know that Harold is extremely intelligent, extremely manipulative, and even from prison, he's shown he has access to information he shouldn't have. What if I'm not being paranoid? What if Harold really has allies on the outside? What if Little Thornwick was truly the center of something far larger and more sinister than I ever imagined? I can't go to the police with these suspicions. I already gave my testimony. Harold was convicted. The case is closed. Without concrete evidence of a broader conspiracy, I just look like a traumatized witness with an overactive imagination. So I live in this constant limbo, never sure if I'm truly safe or if I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. The irony isn't lost on me. I came to Little Thornwick seeking peace and quiet to write. I wanted to escape London's chaos, to find a place where I could focus on my art without distractions. Instead, I found a nightmare that followed me back to the city and has infected every aspect of my life. I can no longer write fiction. Every time I try to create a character, I see Harold's face. Every time I try to imagine dialogue, I hear his voice telling me about his favorite cases. With that mix of academic fascination and personal pride, I now recognize as the signature of a psychopath. Instead, I've started documenting my experience. First, as a form of therapy, then as a warning to others. Because if Harold is telling the truth about Little Thornwick, then there are other villages like it, other places where outsiders disappear and no one asks questions, other places where monsters hide behind friendly smiles and dinner invitations. I've changed my address 3 times in the last 2 years. Every time I start to feel safe in a place, something happens. A letter from Harold, a stranger who seems to be watching me, an inexplicable feeling of being followed, and I have to move again. I don't have close friends now. I can't afford them. How can I trust anyone after living next to a serial killer for months without suspecting a thing? How can I be sure that anyone showing interest in my friendship doesn't have hidden motives? I only go out when absolutely necessary. I shop at different places each time, never establishing patterns someone could follow. I have 3 mobile phones, each registered under a different name. I know this isn't a way to live. I know I'm letting Harold control me, even from prison, letting fear dictate every decision I make. But I also know that the alternative, living normally, trusting people, establishing routines, could be fatal if I'm right about the extent of what I uncovered in Little Thornwick. Harold's most recent letter arrived exactly 1 week ago. This time, the envelope had no prison return address. It was postmarked from York, as if someone on the outside had mailed it for him. Inside was just one line. Jose, I hope you're enjoying your new life in London. Give my regards to Emily. When you see her tonight, Emily is the woman I'd been dating for the last 3 months. I hadn't told anyone about her. We'd been very discreet because she's married and in the process of a divorce. The night before, I'd met her for the first time at her apartment instead of a hotel. There was no way Harold could know about Emily unless someone had been watching me very closely. That night, I canceled my date with Emily and ended our relationship over the phone. I couldn't explain why without sounding completely insane, so I just told her I wasn't ready for a serious relationship. Since then, I haven't had any romantic contact with anyone. I can't risk putting someone else in danger. Last night, while writing this account, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Footsteps that stopped right at my door and stayed there for several minutes before moving away. When I finally mustered the courage to look through the peephole, no one was there. But on the floor, right in front of my door, was a small silver cross, identical to the one I'd found in the bag buried in the woods, the same one that had belonged to Jennifer Walsh. That cross is now on my desk as I write. It's the only physical evidence I have that I'm not imagining all this, that the threat is real. It's also a reminder that Harold, even from prison, apparently has the ability to reach me whenever he wants. I don't know what to do with this information. I don't know who I can tell without sounding like a delusional paranoiac. I don't know how I can live knowing that at any moment someone could show up at my door following the instructions of a serial killer with dementia. What I do know is that I'll never return to Little Thornwick. I'll never fully trust a stranger again, and I'll never be able to see a friendly smile without wondering what secrets lie behind it. Harold Patterson taught me that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who seem completely normal, the ones who invite you to dinner, who care about your well-being, who become part of your family, the ones who care about you enough to keep you alive until you discover who they really are. Now I live knowing that somewhere, in a prison cell in Yorkshire, an old man with dementia thinks of me every day. He plans ways to remind me that, though he's locked up, his reach extends far beyond his cell walls. I live knowing I'll never be truly safe, because Harold knows that I know who he really is, And though my neighbor never acted or tried anything during all those months of friendly dinners and conversations, I now live in constant fear. Because I know he knows I discovered he's a killer. And killers, as Harold taught me during our long nighttime talks, never forget those who know their secrets, especially when they have all the time in the world to plan their revenge. My name is Henry. I'm 34 years old and I'm a freelance graphic designer. 2.5 years ago, I moved to a new town seeking a quiet place where I could work from home and escape the chaos of Sydney. What I'm about to tell you is the reason I now live in Melbourne after having to abandon what I thought would be my perfect home in rural New South Wales. I had found a beautiful house in Willowbrook, a village of just 1,800 people, about 4 hours west of Sydney. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. A Federation-style house from the early 20th century, with 3 bedrooms, high ceilings, and a large study where I could set up my office. The price was a fraction of what something similar would have cost in Sydney, and the town had that Australian rural charm that had always drawn me in. Willowbrook was surrounded by farmland and rolling hills, with a main street that had all the essentials: an IGA supermarket, a pharmacy, a pub, a post office, and a small police station that was open only 3 days a week. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where kids rode bikes until late, and where people still waved as they drove by. Or so I thought. I moved in early March of 2022, just as the Australian summer was winding down and the temperatures were becoming more pleasant. The house had been empty for several months before I bought it and needed some basic repairs, but nothing I couldn't handle. My property was on Eucalyptus Lane, a quiet street on the edge of town with only 6 houses. My house was the third from the end of the street, with a large front garden full of native trees and a backyard that opened directly onto the Australian bush. My closest neighbors were the Nguyens to the left, a Vietnamese-Australian family with 2 young children who seemed lovely, and to the right, at the end of the street, lived a man named Derek Walsh. My first encounter with Derek was the day after I moved in. I was unloading boxes from my van when he approached, walking down the path. He was a man of about 50 years old, tall and stocky, with messy grey hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. He wore a dirty, sleeveless shirt and shorts that had seen better days. "So you're the new guy," he said, without introducing himself or offering to help with the boxes. "Yeah, I'm Henry," I replied, setting down a heavy box and extending my hand. "Nice to meet you." He looked at my hand, but didn't shake it. "Derek Walsh," he said. "I live there." He pointed toward the house at the end of the street. "Great. Guess we're neighbors then." Derek studied me for an uncomfortably long moment, as if assessing something about me. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Sydney. I work from home, so I thought it'd be nice to live somewhere quieter." "Sydney, huh?" His tone took on an edge I couldn't quite read. "City boy." "Well, I guess so. But I'm looking forward to settling into village life." Derek nodded slowly, but he didn't seem particularly pleased with my response. "This is a quiet place," he said finally. "People here value their privacy. We expect you to keep things quiet." "Of course," I said. "I've got no intention of causing any trouble." "Good," Derek said, then turned and walked away without another word. It was an odd introduction, but I tried not to think too much of it. I'd met plenty of socially awkward people over the years, and not everyone was naturally friendly with strangers. For the first few weeks in Willowbrook, I focused on setting up my home office and getting to know my new surroundings. The house was beautiful once I cleaned it up and fixed some minor plumbing and electrical issues. My study was at the back of the house, with large windows overlooking the bush. It was the perfect workspace, quiet, well lit, and completely free from the distractions of city life. The Nguyens turned out to be wonderful neighbors. Kim and David were professionals who worked in Orange, about 40 minutes away, and their children, 6 and 8 years old, were well-mannered and friendly. They invited me to a family barbecue during my second week, and they helped me navigate the quirks of small-town life. Derek Walsh is a bit odd, Kim told me when I asked about my other neighbors. He's lived here his whole life, but he got more reclusive after his mother died a few years ago. Family? I asked. Not that we know of. Never married, no kids. Lives alone in that big house. Does he work? He gets some kind of disability pension, I think. Doesn't go out much during the day. That explained why he always seemed to be home when I was outside. During those first weeks, I started noticing that Derek had peculiar habits. In the evenings, I'd see him walking around his property, always following the same pattern, from his back door to the fence separating our properties, then along the fence line to the front and back to his house. He'd repeat the circuit several times each evening, always around 6 o'clock. At first, I thought he was just exercising, but there was something ritualistic about the way he did it. Always the same number of laps, always the same time, always stopping at the same points to look toward my house. I also started noticing that he had a particular fascination with lights. His house was completely dark during the day, but at night, he'd turn on lights in different rooms in what seemed like random patterns. One night, all the front lights were on. The next, only the second floor lights. Then just a single light in what seemed to be the basement. They were strange behaviors, but not necessarily alarming. Plenty of people have quirky routines, especially those living alone. It was during my 4th week in Willowbrook that I started to feel something wasn't right. I'd been working late one night, finishing a project for a client with a tight deadline, when I heard a noise outside around midnight. It was a metallic sound, like someone tampering with metal against metal. I looked out my study window, but couldn't see anything in the dark. The sound repeated several times, then stopped. The next day, while having my morning coffee in the backyard, I noticed that the lock on my back door had fresh scratches on the metal, as if someone had tried to force it. It was unsettling, but I tried to rationalize it. It could have been an animal, or maybe the scratches had been there before and I just hadn't noticed. But 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, I was more alert, and when I heard the metallic sound, I got up quietly and looked out the window. There was a dark figure crouched by my back door. My heart started pounding. Someone was trying to break into my house. I moved slowly toward the phone to call the police, but when I looked out the window again, the figure was gone. I turned on all the lights and checked every door and window. They were all secure, but the scratches on the back door lock were definitely new. The next morning, I decided to confront Derek directly. The only houses close enough for someone to approach on foot were his and the Nguyens, and I highly doubted it was David or Kim trying to break in. I found Derek in his front garden, pruning a hedge with an intensity that seemed unnecessary for the task. "Derek," I said, approaching the fence separating our properties. He looked up, but didn't stop pruning. What? Last night, someone was on my property, trying to get into my house. Did you notice anything unusual? Derek stopped pruning and looked at me directly, for the first time since we'd met. Nope, he said. Didn't see anything. You sure? It was around midnight. I thought you might have heard something. I go to bed early, he said, returning to his pruning with renewed vigor. Don't pay attention to what other people are doing at night. There was something about the way he said other people that made me uneasy. Well, if you see anything suspicious, would you let me know? Derek didn't respond, just kept pruning the hedge that, honestly, didn't need pruning. Over the next few weeks, the break-in attempts became more frequent and bolder. At first, whoever was trying to get into my house only did so on nights when all the lights were off and the house seemed empty. But gradually, they started trying even when the lights were on, even when it was obvious I was home. I installed motion sensor lights around my property, hoping they'd deter whoever it was. Instead, they became a kind of early warning system. I'd be working in my study when the lights would suddenly flick on, alerting me that someone was on my property. Each time, I'd look outside to see a dark figure moving around my house, testing doors and windows, looking for a way in. I called the police several times, but the Willowbrook police station, which only operated part-time, had a single officer who worked 3 days a week. Constable Morrison was an older man, about 60 years old, who seemed more interested in resolving disputes over barking dogs than dealing with alleged break-in attempts. Did anyone actually get in? He asked when I reported the 5th incident. No, but that's not the point. Someone's trying to get in, and I want it to stop. Without real evidence of who it is, there's not much we can do, he said. Best I can suggest is you invest in better locks and maybe a security system. I have security lights. Whoever it is doesn't seem deterred by them. Well, keep documenting the incidents. If you catch whoever it is in the act, call right away. But calling right away was problematic when the police station was only open 3 days a week, and the nearest full-time station was in Orange, 40 minutes away. By my 2nd month in Willowbrook, whoever was trying to break into my house had become significantly more aggressive in their attempts. Instead of just trying to pick locks, they started attempting to pry open doors and windows. I found pry marks on door frames, scratches on window locks, and even evidence that someone had tried to remove window screens entirely. I installed better locks on all doors and windows, but that only seemed to make the intruder more determined. Now, instead of giving up when they found a locked door, they spend more time trying different approaches. Worse, they started trying to break in while I was clearly home and awake. I'd be watching TV in the living room when the motion sensor lights would go on, and I'd hear sounds of someone moving outside. Sometimes I could hear them testing different windows, moving from one to another, searching for the weakest point. During these incidents, I'd shout, "I know you're out there! I've called the police." But whoever it was never responded, never ran. They just kept methodically checking every possible entry point. It was during my 3rd month in Willowbrook that I finally realized who my nighttime visitor was. I decided to invest in a proper security camera system. Nothing fancy, just a few wireless cameras that could record any movement around my property and send alerts to my phone. The first night, after installing the cameras, they recorded everything. At 11:47 at night, the cameras caught Derek Walsh leaving his house and walking straight onto my property. For the next 37 minutes, the cameras recorded him systematically testing every door and window, trying various tools to pick locks, and even attempting to climb to the second-floor windows. His face was clearly visible on the infrared cameras. There was no doubt who it was, but the most disturbing thing about the footage was Derek's demeanor. He didn't act like someone trying to commit a crime in secret. He acted like someone performing a routine task, methodical, patient, almost casual, as if this was something he did regularly, something he had every right to do. The next morning, I took the video evidence straight to Derek's door. He answered after several minutes of knocking, looking like he'd just woken up despite it being nearly 10 in the morning. "Derek," I said, "we need to talk." "About what?" "About this," I said, showing him my phone, with the video paused on a clear image of him trying to force my back door. For a moment, Derek's expression didn't change. He looked at the video as if it were something completely mundane. "Yeah," he said finally. So? I couldn't believe his response. "Derek, you're trying to break into my house every night. That's trespassing. It's breaking and entering. It's burglary." "It's not burglary," he said calmly. "I didn't take anything." "Because you couldn't get in." Derek shrugged. "That's my land," he said, gesturing vaguely toward my property. "No, it's not. It's my land. I bought it. I have the deed. My family lived here for 70 years, Derek said, his voice taking on a tone I hadn't heard before. "That house, that land, it's all supposed to be ours. But it's not. It legally belongs to me." "Legal doesn't make it right," Derek said, and there was something in his eyes that made me step back. "Derek, if you don't stop trying to break into my house, I'll have you arrested." "Go ahead," he said. "Call the police. See how much they care about a city boy complaining about a lifelong resident." Then he shut the door in my face. I took the video evidence straight to Constable Morrison. "Well," he said after watching the video, "that's definitely Derek Walsh. So you'll arrest him?" Morrison sighed. "It's complicated." "How is it complicated?" "I have video evidence of him trespassing on my property and trying to break into my house. Derek's got some mental health issues," Morrison explained. "He's been struggling since his mother passed. Social services have been working with him. I don't care about his mental health issues. I care about him staying off my property. I'll talk to him," Morrison said. "I'll try to make him understand he can't do that." "Talk to him." "Constable Morrison, this is criminal behavior. You shouldn't just talk to him. You should arrest him." "Look, Derek's not a bad guy. He's just confused about some things. Sometimes he thinks that land still belongs to his family. I'll explain the situation. Make sure he understands the boundaries." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you telling me that because Derek Walsh has mental health issues, he's allowed to terrorize me in my own home?" "Nobody's being terrorized," Morrison said. "Nobody's been hurt. I'll sort it out." Constable Morrison apparently spoke to Derek because the break-in attempts stopped for nearly a week. I actually started to believe the issue might be resolved, but then they started again, only now Derek was more careful to avoid the cameras. Instead of approaching from the front, where the cameras had caught him before, he started coming through the bush at the back of my property. Instead of trying to break in during reasonable hours when the police might respond, he started coming at 2 or 3 in the morning, times when it was less likely anyone would be awake to call for help. And instead of just testing doors and windows, he started trying more creative approaches. I found ladder marks against the side of my house, where he'd tried to reach the second floor windows. I found evidence he'd been examining my roof, possibly looking for entry through vents or skylights. Most disturbingly, I found signs he'd been digging around the foundations of my house, possibly trying to find access to the basement or create tunnels. Derek Walsh wasn't just trying to break into my house anymore. He was studying every possible approach, like someone planning a serious assault. I invested in a much more sophisticated security system: motion detectors, door and window sensors, night vision cameras, even pressure pads that would alert me if someone walked in certain areas of my property. My house became a fortress, but that meant I was essentially a prisoner inside it. Every night, the alarms would go off as Derek made his rounds. Every night, I'd sit in my house with all the lights on, watching the camera feeds on my laptop, tracking his movements around my property. I called the police every time, but the response times were terrible. By the time anyone arrived, Derek was back on his own property, and there was no evidence of wrongdoing beyond my camera footage. "We can't arrest someone for walking in their own yard," Morrison explained when I demanded action. "It's not his yard. He was on my property." "Camera angles can be deceptive," Morrison said. "Maybe it just looked like he was on your property." It was clear that Constable Morrison either couldn't or wouldn't help me. Word about my conflict with Derek started spreading through the town, and to my astonishment, most people seemed to side with Derek. At the IGA, the cashier who'd once been friendly turned cold and distant. "Heard you're having trouble with Derek Walsh," she said as she scanned my groceries. "He's been trying to break into my house every night for months." "Derek's a good man," she said firmly. "His family built half this town. He wouldn't bother anyone unless he had a good reason." Good reason? What possible good reason could there be for breaking and entering? She didn't respond, just finished scanning my groceries in silence. Similar conversations happened at the pub, the post office, even the local mechanic when I took my car in for service. "Derek Walsh is a respected member of this community," people would tell me. "Maybe you should try being friendlier with your neighbors instead of calling the police on him." Some suggested I was exaggerating the situation, that Derek was probably just walking on his own property, and I was misinterpreting his actions. Others implied that, as an outsider, I didn't understand local customs and relationships. "People in Willowbrook look out for each other," one longtime resident told me. "Maybe Derek just thinks you're suspicious and is keeping an eye on you for the rest of us." No matter how I explained the situation, no matter what evidence I provided, people seemed determined to believe Derek was the victim and I was the problem. By my 5th month in Willowbrook, Derek's behavior escalated to a genuinely terrifying level. Instead of just trying to break into my house, he started waging psychological warfare. He left dead animals on my front porch, possums, birds, even a small kangaroo Joey that had clearly been killed elsewhere and left at my door. He played loud music from his property at all hours, always stopping just short of a level that could justify a noise complaint. He stood in his yard, clearly visible from my windows, and stared at my house for hours. Most disturbingly, he started leaving notes. At first, he slipped them under my front door. "Go back to Sydney. You don't belong here. Leave while you can." But gradually, the notes became more specific and threatening. "I know when you sleep. I know when you're not home. I'll get in eventually." I took every note to Constable Morrison, but his response was always the same. "I'll talk to Derek again." After 6 months of harassment, I demanded a meeting with someone higher up than Constable Morrison. I was put in touch with Sergeant Davies from the Orange Police Station. "I've been harassed by my neighbor for 6 months," I told him. "I have video evidence, I have photographs, I have threatening notes. Why hasn't Derek Walsh been arrested?" Sergeant Davies reviewed my file, which by then was several inches thick. "It's a complex situation," he said finally. "It's not complex. He's breaking the law. Repeatedly, Derek Walsh has lived in Willowbrook his whole life," Davies explained. "His family was among the original settlers. He's well known and respected in the community. I don't care how long he's been here. That doesn't give him the right to terrorize me. There's also the matter of his mental state," Davies continued. "He was evaluated by a psychiatrist last month, who determined that while he has certain fixation issues, he's not dangerous." "Not dangerous? He's trying to break into my house every night. He's never actually gotten into your house, never physically harmed you, and never made direct threats against your person. The notes he's been leaving are direct threats. The notes are concerning, but they're not legally actionable unless they contain specific threats of violence." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So unless Derek Walsh actually breaks into my house and physically attacks me, no one's going to do anything. We've spoken to him multiple times. We've made it clear he needs to respect property boundaries. Beyond that, without evidence of actual criminal intent." "Criminal intent? What more evidence do you need?" But it was clear that no amount of evidence was going to convince the police to take action against Derek Walsh. By the 8th month, I was on the verge of a breakdown. I wasn't sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours a night because Derek's harassment had become relentless. I was losing clients because I couldn't focus on my work. I was developing anxiety and depression from the constant stress. Sarah and I had been together for 3 years, and she had planned to move to Willowbrook to live with me. But after visiting and seeing firsthand what I was dealing with, she made her own decision. "Henry, this isn't healthy," she told me during what would be our last weekend together in Willowbrook. "You're becoming paranoid and obsessed. You need to get out of this place." "I can't let him win," I said. "If I leave, he'll just do the same to whoever moves in next." "That's not your responsibility," she said. "Your responsibility is to take care of yourself." That night, Derek seemed to sense something was different. Instead of his usual break-in attempts, he stood in his front yard all night, staring at my house. Whenever I looked out any window, there he was, motionless, staring back. It was like being watched by some kind of predator who knew I was weak and vulnerable. The final incident that convinced me to leave happened in my 9th month in Willowbrook. I'd fallen asleep in my desk chair while working late. I was woken around 3 in the morning by the sound of glass breaking. I grabbed my phone and checked the security cameras. Derek had thrown a rock through my kitchen window and was climbing through the opening. For the first time in 9 months, he'd managed to get into my house. I called emergency services immediately. "Someone's broken into my house," I told the operator. "He's inside right now. Are you in immediate danger?" "Yes, he's in my kitchen and I'm upstairs. Stay where you are and don't confront the intruder." Police are on their way, but the police were 40 minutes away and Derek was in my house. I could hear him moving downstairs, opening and closing drawers, walking from room to room. He wasn't being stealthy. He moved like he owned the place. Eventually, I heard footsteps on the stairs. He was coming up to find me. I locked my bedroom door and pushed furniture against it, but Derek didn't even try to get in. He just stood outside in the hallway, and I could hear his breathing. "I know you're in there," he said finally. "This is my house. It's always been my house." He stayed there for nearly 20 minutes before I heard him go back downstairs. By the time the police arrived, he'd left through the same broken window. When the police processed the crime scene, they found Derek's fingerprints all over my house, clear evidence that he hadn't just broken in, but had spent considerable time going through my belongings. "We can definitely charge him now," Sergeant Davies told me. But Derek was arrested on a Friday afternoon. Because it was the weekend, he couldn't be seen by a magistrate until Monday morning. He was released on his own recognizance with instructions to stay away from my property. That Sunday night, he came back. This time, he didn't try to break in. He just stood in my front yard all night, staring at my house. When I called the police, they told me that standing on a public street wasn't illegal, even if it made me uncomfortable. On Monday morning, when Derek appeared in court, he was sentenced to 2 weeks in jail and 2 years of probation with the condition that he stay away from my property. 2 weeks. For 9 months of harassment, property damage, trespassing, and breaking and entering, Derek Walsh got 2 weeks in jail. While he was serving his sentence, I put my house up for sale. The real estate agent told me honestly that selling would be difficult. "News travels in a small town," she explained. "People know about the trouble with Derek. That'll affect the value." She was right. I ended up selling the house for $40,000, less than what I'd paid for it, barely enough to cover my mortgage and moving expenses. Derek was released from jail 2 days before the sale was finalized. On the morning of the closing, I saw him standing in his front yard, watching as I loaded the last of my belongings into a moving truck. As I drove away from Willowbrook for the last time, he was still there, staring. I moved to Melbourne and eventually rebuilt my life. I found a great apartment in Fitzroy, reconnected with clients I'd lost during my ordeal in Willowbrook, and slowly regained my mental health. Sarah and I tried to make our relationship work long distance, but the damage from my experience with Derek had changed me in ways that were hard to undo. We broke up 6 months after I moved to Melbourne. I heard from Kim Nguyen about 6 months later that Derek had already started harassing the new owners of my house, a young couple from Brisbane who'd moved to Willowbrook for the same reasons I had. "The police still won't do anything substantial," she told me. "Constable Morrison keeps saying Derek just needs time to adjust. As far as I know, Derek Walsh still lives in Willowbrook, still harassing his neighbors, still being protected by a community that refuses to acknowledge that one of their own is dangerous, and the police still do nothing about it. I had to move because there was nothing I could do about it. The police wouldn't do anything at all."